Hello, this is Eric from Bay Area Hang Gliding, reading beginner ground school articles to make wing hang gliding more accessible to pilots. This is Stalls by John Lake. It's from 1977 Ground Skimmer magazine, which turned into Hang Gliding magazine, and I'm sure they've reprinted it over the years. Most explanations of flight take you into an intellectual land filled with Bernoulli vector diagrams and elegant equations. This may be a garden for designers, but it is a swamp for pilots. Have you ever heard a pilot in trouble call out for Bernoulli or offer up a final expletive of P equals 1/2 P vector squared equals H just before the crunch? Exhaustive research in the field has shown that the pilot's most frequent piloting words are, "oh shit." It has been assumed by these researchers that pilots are simply an uncouth crew of semi-literates. However, independent research has brought out the fact that the expletive refers to the pilot's opinion of a theory of flight which he has discovered too late and is useless in crisis. Elegant theories of flight laced with impressive differential equations are not the stuff from which a clear mental picture of controlling flight is drawn. They are the tools of designers, not pilots. These quantitative theories are generally classed as the "oh shit" group. Pilots should learn useful concepts from a qualitative group, sometimes referred to as the "made it again" group of explanations. We must never confuse theory, no matter how hoary, from repetition with explanation. All of us have read countless books and articles describing the airflow over and under the wing of an airfoil. If you haven't, you should. The stall is defined as the point or angle of attack at which the airflow separates and dissolves into a mess of eddies. That's true enough, but the writers spoil it by then announcing that most of the lift is lost because the top surface is the major source of lift. Yet they fail to speak of the role of drag, and this failing is where they lead us down the path of pain. The fact is, assuming a constant airspeed, not that much lift is lost as you stall. The loss amounts to something like 20 or 30%. That loss could be compensated for by an increase in airspeed of only about 15%, or something like 3 miles per hour on an ordinary hang glider. Of course, the problem is getting that 3 miles per hour. This brings us to the sin of not emphasizing the role that drag plays in a stall. It is the increase of drag, not the decrease of lift, that can bring worry lines to the face of a pilot. But first, the law of stalls. 1. The severity of stall is proportional to surprise. 2. The pain of a stall is relative to how hard you hit the ground. 3. A painful stall grows from a severe stall. The study of the role of drag during a stall is the Rosetta Stone, means of discovery of these laws. Suppose your glider had two instruments which showed its lift and drag characteristics. Suppose that each instrument read half scale, say 50 on a scale of 0 to 100, at an airspeed which gave minimum sink performance. Now, suppose you slowed up a little so that the stall resulted. The lift indicator would drop a little, around 35 or 40, but the drag indicator would go right off the top of its scale. The clear result would be that you would have to increase your rate of descent drastically to maintain what airspeed and lift you have remaining. If the glider is not allowed to drop to compensate for this huge increase in drag, the airspeed will be jerked right out from under you, then lift will be reduced sharply, and you will fall out of the sky. But keep in mind that the original culprit is the increase of drag. An explanation of the three laws of stalls is now in order. When you expect a stall, you react as soon as it occurs. You get the nose down a little and immediately, so that you don't lose much more airspeed than what little is lost is quickly regained. But if the stall comes as a surprise, you will react late in the game, and you may try to maintain the altitude period, forcing the nose even higher. This allows drag, the time needed to suck away your airspeed, ensuring the necessity of a longer recovery period. Even worse, the chances are that one wing will precede the other into the stalled condition. Wing drops. The much greater drag will tend to pivot the glider around, which will reduce the wing's airspeed and lift relative to the other wing. This, of course, is the start of a spin or a rolling crunch into the ground. The proof of this pudding lies in the fact that, regardless of aircraft type, very few practice stalls. They are not surprises, result in spins, whereas most accidental stalls result in a wing dropping out. All this is to emphasize the first law. The severity of a stall is proportional to surprise. The second law should be obvious. Air causes no pain. The ground does. And the awkwardness with which you hit the ground can contribute to how hard you hit it. The third law should be simple. If something will hurt, you won't want to do it. The only intentional stall you'll be likely to do when near the ground is during the landing. But if your mind is on the crowd, winning the spot landing contests, trying to get rid of altitude with low S-turns, or hanging on to altitude to clear some wires, then the stall can sneak up on you and be a painful surprise in its severity. Now, let's get into flying. Consider a pilot who thinks himself advanced. He decides to soar the face of a hill where he sees Henry Hotshoe staying up. Our hero's glider is known to be mellow, and he has practiced stalls a number of times. He makes a few passes back and forth along the hill and finds himself right up there with Henry. He vows that now is a time to show that he can stay up there with the experts. He slows up a little more, milking the lift. He finds himself a little above and behind Harry and is really pleased with himself. He thinks how great this is, how he is a boring bird. He loses a little altitude and without thinking pushes out a little more. Without any apparent warning, his mellow glider starts to roll into the hill and drop its nose. His momentary response, being caught by surprise, is to push out and to try and turn away from the hill. The glider just falls off into the hill and he wakes up in traction. Our hero was the victim of thinking that practicing intentional stalls would prepare him for accidental stalls. He was not prepared for this stall, so he failed to do the only thing that will correct for a stall. Get the nose down immediately and sharply before drag takes its toll of remaining airspeed and lift. Now let's relate to an actual accidental stall at a bad time. During a tight turn near the ground, a national champion hang glider pilot was competing at Dog Mountain Nationals. He was doing a series of figure eights over some pylons downwind of the landing area, and he was getting very low. He had a chance at the contest if he could crank out one more turn around the pylons, so he turned toward them, away from the landing area, for one last pass. He suddenly realized that he was getting too low and would have to get back or he'd land short. He turned abruptly and stalled the glider at an altitude of about 40 feet. He realized his error and momentarily pulled forward. He lost about 15 feet of altitude and came up short of the landing area. The point is that with everything riding on not losing altitude, he still allowed his conditional reflex to cause himself to pull in at the first sign of stall. If he had hesitated at all, he would have piled right in and would have been hurt. That conditioned reflex is what every pilot has to acquire. There is only one way to acquire this reflex, and it is to not go up and practice intentional stalls. They will help to teach you that a well-designed glider will recover, but that's about all they will do for you. The way to learn about stalls is to practice not stalling, seeing just how close you can come to them without stalling. This is of course called slow flight. The first step is to pick a nice, large, smooth landing area. Then make a fast approach and try and keep the glider about 6 feet above the ground and pay attention to the feel of the glider just before it lets you down. Then follow this exercise at an altitude of at least a few hundred feet. Try to not let the glider stall just to see how close you can come to the stall. If you do it right, you will stall sometimes. When you do stall, pop the nose down a little just as soon as you realize what's happening. Pretty soon you will seldom really stall and you will gain a feel for things when they were slow and sticky. Then, the next step is to do the same thing in gentle turns, then steeper turns. Always practice this slow flight away from the hard ground and only in a well-designed modern hang glider. After a few hundred accidental partial stalls out of slow flight, you will be ready to take on Henry Hotshoes, and you will be a far better pilot than those who spend their time flailing around the sky, impressing all those who have yet to recognize precision flying when they see it. Thank you, everyone. I think that's a pretty good reading.